If you haven't already watched the Keynes Vs Hayek battle rap, you should do so because I will be referring to it. Don't expect you to notice everything that it took me several times watching to notice, like the name tags for the bartenders were Ben and Hank, after Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson, the chairman of the Fed and Secretary of the Treasury, respectively, when the famous or infamous, depending on your perspective, bailouts of immediately following the 2008 crisis were landed. But it's that battle rap is kind of a segue into what I'm going to do now, which is kind of go through the build-up to the Great Depression and then talk about the Great Depression and all the decades after that up to the present in a very brief, way too quick, in a nutshell kind of way. What I'm going to try to do, as I've mentioned before, I'm not a good team player for either side of the political spectrum. I have left-wing views or left-of-center views and right-of-center views, and I go back and forth on some of the same issues. But either way, I also don't want to unduly influence anybody. I've been in classes where the instructors' opinions were taught as though they're the only opinion anybody has, and I try to make sure I know what the best arguments are on every side, so I try to bring them up here. And I do this as a sort of Team Keynes versus Team Hayek framework. I don't like to use things like left and right. I don't like labels and categories. I think they're too overly simplistic. But they're really, economists do kind of go into camps that either like Keynes or dislike Keynes, and like Hayek or dislike Hayek. So the things that I'm saying here, the things on these slides, are not necessarily things that Keynes himself said or things that Hayek himself said. In fact, some of these things Keynes or Hayek might actually disagree with. Instead, it's, again, I have to be a little overly simplistic here so that we don't have hours worth of videos. There are a lot of nuances I'm not going to get into, even though I might want to. I think they're interesting. But it's really a way of trying to do a catch-all thing that captures some of the divides among economists and their actual viewpoints. So, starting with Team Keynes and the lead-up to the Great Depression. So the Great Depression, many of you have probably already gone over it in your history classes. You know a lot about it. The stock market had a huge crash in 1929. And the economy fell with it. And this crash, and of course when the economy fell, there really wasn't much of a recovery. Life in the United States was much harder than it had been in the decades previous for over a decade. And it was a very novel thing because previous recessions, while some had been even deeper, they recovered very, very quickly. So this was a very novel time, as well as a very painful time. It was economically very novel. And one of the things that led up to it that you may or may not be aware of from history classes was that not only the stock market throughout the 20s was just booming. And it was booming. There were a lot of people who thought there were massive improvements in technology over the time. Electricity in people's homes, along with plumbing, was becoming much more standard for even lower income persons. A lot of incredible new inventions were happening. I mean, it was a mass. I mean, people who were adults during the 1920s could remember the way people lived when we watch Old West movies. That was what their life was like. And then in the 1920s, all of a sudden, they flick on a light switch and they're driving cars all over the place. That was still something for more upper income people, but it was already becoming a little more accessible to everybody else. It really seemed like a new world, and it was difficult to imagine that anything would ever go bad. So there was a lot of optimism that helped fuel the stock market, to the point where, and this is important, banks actually lent money to people knowing that they were going to put the money in the stock market looking for a quick return. This isn't lending money to people who are trying to build a mutual fund and get a head start on retirement and pay back when they retire, which, I mean, the long period of time you have to go without getting payment, banks wouldn't necessarily do that anyway. And banks are generally forbidden from speculating in the stock market themselves, for for reasons that, if they're not obvious yet, they should be obvious after we look at what happens when banks collapse because of investments and money and wealth that just goes away. So banks were lending money to people to put in the stock market who had to pay back their loans quickly. So naturally, I mean, if people are getting those quick returns as they're selling to somebody else who's getting in on the action, they can pay the bank back just fine. So banks are doing fine, investors are doing fine until the market crashes in 29, and all of a sudden the bank has loans that are due and people can't repay them. So the asset side of banks' balance sheets crumbles. Meanwhile, people are running into banks to get money out. We already saw how that works. So a lot of banks ended up going away. They went out of business, which means a lot of wealth just vanished very, very quickly. So in the lead up, the Team Keynes view looks at ever since Woodrow Wilson left office in 1920, Warren Harding, and then after his death in office, his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, they were the presidents throughout the 20s. They were Republican presidents with conservative viewpoints on the economy. There was a lot of union busting that went on. Top tax rate was lowered. I actually have a slide that gives a history of the tax rate for the richest 1%. There's an argument that goes around that cutting taxes on the rich doesn't work, and it's a very vague argument, and it might be correct. The thing is, if you put this up next to periods of economic growth when the top tax rate is lowered, this is a period of growth. This is a period of really bad times economically when it was raised up. And we're going to get to some of this, but when the top tax rate is cut, we usually do see better economic performance. Not always, but often enough to where it might not entirely be correct to say that cutting taxes for the rich doesn't have any positive benefit for the economy. It's also not definitively something we can say for sure that it does benefit the economy. So it's going to come up a few times in this slide. Let's go back to the... So a lot of conservative policies leading up to the crash, and income inequality also had grown quite a bit. Statistics really aren't... It's difficult to keep them accurately before the 1900s, so there's really not much known about a really precise understanding of inequality until the 1900s, but we do have a good knowledge of the inequality during the 20s, and it had grown quite a bit. So that's the Team Keynes view. Team Hayek people will say, okay, there was some laissez-faire stuff going on in the 20s, but there was also a lot of anti-laissez-faire stuff going on. The Federal Reserve is one of the big ones. Remember, it's a problem that loans were given to people just to buy stocks with them for a quick payback, and the Federal Reserve was actually helping to fuel this. Interest rates were at the lowest points they had ever been in history, and economists across the political spectrum know exactly what happens when interest rates are low. You're going to have some artificial gains in the stock market. So Hayek types tend to blame the Fed for feeding these gains. Oh, you know what? We've talked about Keynes. We didn't talk much about Hayek. I'm going to do a brief aside here to introduce us a little more. He's that sort of awkward guy who everybody knows and loves Keynes. Keynes is a popular one. Hayek is not so popular, well-liked. They kind of spoofed that difference between them, where here I am. Again, I've already talked about Keynes quite a bit, but not a whole heck of a lot about Hayek. So Hayek fought for Germany during World War I and was a practicing economist when the Weimar Republic fell and Hitler rose to power. He was in Germany as an economist watching Hitler's rise to power, and then watching the Great Depression. He had fled Germany, and when after World War II, he noticed a lot of his a lot of people in academia and other departments were blaming capitalism for the rise of Hitler, and Hayek, as an economist, watched how Hitler ran as a socialist and kind of went against capitalism, and so he was worried that they were advocating exactly the kinds of things that helped Hitler's rise to power. Hayek has a view on the economy that you have to have free markets to prevent having despotism. He wrote a book called The Road to Serfdom that basically lays out the argument that one of the first things you have to do if you want a sort of brutal totalitarian dictatorship is get rid of free markets. And it's a controversial viewpoint in the field of economics and out, but there are many economists who do agree that while it's not a sufficient condition for having a free society, it is a necessary condition. You can't have a free society without free market capitalism. Hayek he's kind of opposite Team Keynes, first of all, because they had a lot of debates during their lifetimes. They were actually close friends, but on completely different sides of the issue, and were very critical of each other's different viewpoints on economics. But Hayek continues to be sort of a hero for more right-of-center, free market-oriented economists, while Keynes continues to be sort of a hero for more left-of-center, still free market, but more government intervention-oriented economists. So that's who that Hayek guy is, who I'm talking about here. So they point to the Federal Reserve being very anti-laissez-faire, along with other things like the imposition of an income tax. It was a very non-laissez-faire period, so to blame the crash on laissez-faire doesn't quite work. There's also this less talked about thing where wasn't all local governments, but a lot of local governments essentially created trade wars with other governments when it came to their banks. Banks weren't able to spread their risk, so when the Dust Bowl stuff happened, all those droughts throughout the United States that were one of the pins that popped the stock market bubble, when that happened, a lot of banks that didn't necessarily have to close down did, because just that one local farm was driving the bank's prosperity. That one local farm goes down and the bank finds itself in a very difficult place. So both sides have already managed to blame the economic viewpoints they don't agree with for the Great Depression. Again, I'm looking to not take sides here, just lay out the cases that both sides bring out there. So these are the two viewpoints on what helped to lead to the Great Depression, and we will talk about the Great Depression in